Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we do have an exciting presentation for you ahead. First, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. So today's session is in fact being recorded. So if you would like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab. You'll find that Q&A portion on the right side of the screen, where you will also find the chat tab. And that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members, or maybe just let us know from where you are tuning in. We do have 2 polls throughout today's program, so we highly encourage your participation there. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So on to the topic of our program today, Kubernetes Security Guardrails. I'm joined by Kendall Miller, Technology Evangelist at Fairwinds, Robert Brennan, Vice President of Product Development at Fairwinds, and Ivan Fetch, a developer at Fairwinds. So Kendall, Robert, Ivan, thank you all so much for joining me today. Kendall, do you want to go ahead and get us kicked off?
Yeah, thanks, Cody. We'll go ahead and dive in. So welcome, folks. We are going to be talking today about Kubernetes security guardrails, blind spots, the kinds of things that you might not know you need in the security world of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a whole different paradigm, a whole new world out there, and we'll dive a little bit into that and talk about why security is different in Kubernetes. Excited to have you here. Let's start with some introductions. So, Ivan, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ivan Fetch. I'm a software developer at Fairwinds, currently working on some of our open source as well as our software as a service product that helps folks secure their Kubernetes world.
And Robert?
I'm Robert Brennan. I'm VP of Product Development here at Fairwinds. I lead up all the development efforts on Fairwinds Insights, which is our platform for doing Kubernetes security, efficiency, and reliability.
And hey, folks, my name's Kendall Miller. I'm a technical evangelist here at Fairwinds. Excited to be with you today to be talking about these things. Real quick, a little bit of background on Fairwinds. So Fairwinds has been in business 7.5 years. It's a little hard to believe, saying out loud. We have been a Kubernetes company for the vast majority of that time, helping companies succeed with Kubernetes as it's gone from bleeding edge technology to everybody's using it or trying to use it. And today we build software that implements guardrails for people around security, policy, governance, as well as some cost management within Kubernetes. So everyone's kind of afraid they're going to be using Kubernetes wrong as they adjust to this new paradigm, or they're already using it and confident they are using it wrong. So we build software to give people confidence that they can do it right, do it the right way. So that's who we are at Fairwinds. The reason we're talking about guardrails, blind spots, and security is because that's the world we live in. Fairwinds builds software to help people avoid those issues, and excited to talk about that in depth a little bit with you today. So before we get started, let's talk about where you are in your Kubernetes journey. We have a poll we'll pull up here. Are you just learning about Kubernetes and containers? Are you planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months? Are you using it only in testing or a development environment, or are you using it in production? And we ask for this poll every time so that we can kind of track adoption across all of our webinars. So excited to have folks fill this out. And once you've put some things in, we can pull up some of the results. Click a button, tell us what you're doing. There we go. Wow, it came in here faster than it's coming in even in my live feed over here, which is interesting. So learning about containers and Kubernetes, about 29%. a little bit less planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months, and more using it in production, you can still click that button. We're still collecting that data, but tends to be the spread that we see. It tends to be people who are just learning about Kubernetes and containers or are already using it in production that tend to attend these webinars and want to hear about security in Kubernetes. Either you're just getting started and you want to avoid the pitfalls as you go, or you're already using it in production and you know you need help. So this lines up with our expectations in some ways. We'll give that about 10 more seconds and we'll wrap up. Jeopardy music, obligatory. 1 or 2 more responses, seeing those come in. Thanks for hitting that button on the poll. It's helpful for us. And we can wrap that up. Okay, let's keep going. Did that wrap up? I hit the little X mark. Did that disappear for y'all? Okay, good. I'm going to keep going. Polling question. So first, let's define what guardrails are. So guardrails are a strong fence on the side of a road in the middle of an expressway intended to reduce the risk of serious accidents, or a rail that prevents people from falling off or being hit by something, which is very apt given Kubernetes guardrails, people trying to avoid problems in Kubernetes. Putting a guardrail up keeps people from falling off that cliff or driving off that expressway, as the case may be. And we've got a good picture of a guardrail being used to its full potential. Let's say that.
Doing its job.
Doing its job. You don't want to have to hit the guardrail. But when you hit the guardrail, you're really, really happy that the guardrail is there. Let's say that. There's the life-saving effects of a guardrail in a car, right? And when we talk about guardrails as they relate to Kubernetes, there is the company-saving effects of putting in place guardrails that keep you from doing something that really, really will cause you problems. And there's also the bit that it creates a sense of security, right? When you drive up a mountain road that's a tiny, skinny mountain road and there's guardrails along the side, you don't intend to use them, but you're glad they're there because you know at any given moment you could slip up, and having something there is a big deal. So there's both the security side of it like that, but there's also, it creates a sense of fun. So this is another kind of guardrail. If you've ever been bowling, this is a picture of blow-up bumpers along the side of a bowling alley. When you're just getting started in something new, having guardrails in place to guide you so that you don't mess up, you don't end up in the gutter over and over and over and over again, which anybody who's used a new technology knows. It's real nice to just have that blow up bumper all the way along the side so that you don't get gutter ball after gutter ball as you go. So let's talk about what Kubernetes security guardrails are and why we care. And maybe before we dive into that specifically, let's talk about why we need guardrails in Kubernetes at all. I mean, why do we need security guardrails anywhere, not just Kubernetes? Let's start there, Ivan, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics to why Kubernetes is different and a new paradigm, Robert. But let's start, Ivan, with just guardrails at all. Why does anybody need guardrails?
Yeah,
why
so
do we care?
I think that guardrails help keep folks enabled to do what they need to do using something like a Kubernetes cluster, since this is what we're here talking about. And they allow you to do what you need to do while providing you sort of softer, bouncier, safer edges on the other side of which are things that are dangerous to your organization, your business, your data, your application, your uptime, and your security. So ultimately, I think the advantage of something like guardrails is instead of having a process or some kind of intermediary involved that is perhaps feeling like or actually slowing you down, where you have to get with a particular group to make something happen, or maybe it's adverse change control processes that feel a little bit too intense. You're still empowered as a user of Kubernetes, and in this case, to deploy your workloads. And if you start deploying something that's out of bounds of organizational policy and security and so on, then that's what the guardrails are here to sort of steer you away from in a gentle way, hopefully with some feedback that says, hey, this is why this wasn't allowed. Here's how you can go in and remediate this setting in a more advisable way.
Yeah. And to be clear, we are going to come back to, I mentioned at the beginning of this, Fairwinds makes software to enable this. We're going to be spending some time talking about where to put guardrails and how to implement guardrails with our software, with other open source software as well. We're going to be talking about that as we get into the nitty gritty here as we go. I will add the other bit about guardrails is they're necessary for implementing service ownership. So service ownership is the idea that you're pushing the ownership, the responsibility of maintaining the security posture in the applications down to the developer rather than having an ops team be responsible for all of it. So you can think of, in the old days, if the ops team was going to be responsible for everything that got shipped through to production, it's kind of like a train, right? There's a conductor who knows what they're doing on rails, going up through the mountains in a very tight controlled way. You know which train, the train's going one direction. It's not going to run into another train in theory because the train professionals know what they're doing and everybody can just get on board and, not pay attention and check out and you can take a nap in the back. But if we want to allow people to get in their cars and weave up those mountains, now we have to put security measures in place to keep people on track. So that's what the service ownership bit is. Giving people access to cars so they can drive themselves wherever they go involves building roads, building guardrails, putting rules in place so that people aren't crashing into each other everywhere. Otherwise, we just have to go back to the train. And trains are real nice sometimes. It's don't get me wrong, it's real nice to just get on a train and go to sleep. It's nice to not need guardrails sometimes, but as organizations get bigger, they end up having to delegate those things. So before we move on to Robert, I mentioned, talk a little bit about Kubernetes is a whole new paradigm. What's new about it? What's different about it? Why are the guardrails different at all? Why do we have to talk about Kubernetes guardrails instead of just, it's the cloud? We've been doing guardrails all along.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it around by talking about service ownership. It's really, Kubernetes allows you to build a platform for developers to ship into. So instead of having, a sysadmin, like in the old days, managing all your servers and the developers basically just writing source code and throwing it over the wall, now with Kubernetes, developers are able to take more control over, the applications that they're shipping into the cluster and what those applications look like, how they behave, how they scale, et cetera. It's easier for those development teams to kind of do something stupid to, set, their memory and CPU requests way too high or way too low, not set some security configuration that would, help pare things down a little bit. So there's a lot of options that Kubernetes offers to the development teams that are shipping their applications that you need to make sure that those developers are taking advantage of as much as possible.
Great. Yeah, so let's talk about some very specific security guardrails. Let's give some examples of insecure capabilities, and which of you wants to dive in on that one to start?
Yeah, sure. So what we mean here by capabilities are essentially a capability is granting a privilege to a container running in Kubernetes without that container necessarily having to run as root or what we think of as the administrative user on a Kubernetes node. So there are capabilities that are still very dangerous, even though your container might not be running, quote unquote, as the root user. So there's a capability, for example, called cap_sysadmin that is essentially root privileges. And so this particular bullet here is referencing a goal as a guardrail of making sure that your workload running in Kubernetes only runs with a limited or without a full set of capabilities. So ideally, you want to specify a security context in your workload that drops all capabilities and then adds in individual capabilities that your workload needs so that you can reduce your potential attack surface and you can reduce an attacker's ability to potentially jump from a workload they may have gained access to into other workloads or into the cluster itself. And there's more granular ways to do this as well, but this is what we mean when we say capabilities in this context.
Yeah, least privilege as that's talked about. It's a little bit insecure secure capabilities is you can put a kid in a room and give them a box full of blocks to play with, or you can put a kid in a room, give them a box full of blocks to play with, and a blowtorch. They don't need the blowtorch to play with the blocks. Probably that's a capability that the kid doesn't need. And it's the same thing in Kubernetes. Like, there's just no reason to give somebody a blowtorch, and giving them root access or admin access is essentially doing so. Now, that's an overstatement, but I like my analogy. So,
I mean, blowtorches do make blocks a lot more fun. So there's that.
It is a different way to play with blocks when Daddy gives me the blowtorch. Is that what you're saying?
It is. Yeah.
So related to this, and several of these are related, but Robert, talk about privilege escalation being allowed and how that's different from insecure capabilities.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that makes containers so nice and lightweight is that they share a lot of resources with the system that they're running on, right? And so, for instance, like if you run your container as the root user, inside that container, you might expect, okay, well, that root user is sandboxed the container, but if they manage to escape the container somehow, they now have root access on the host, right? So whatever you give them permission to do inside the container, if they escape the container, they now have that permission on the host. So it's super important to kind of pare down their permissions within the container. That means, disabling privilege escalation. That means disabling running as the root user, in order to just make sure that, in the worst case scenario where the attacker does manage to escape that environment, they have minimal permissions on the host that's running that container.
Yeah, this is the kid has discovered that he can play with a blowtorch, and the door to the nursery is unlocked, and he has access to the whole school. And so that's the kid's probably not going to go around from there, but like a nefarious actor causes problems, and people do escape from containers. This is a very real thing. It's nefarious actors out there do get their hands into containers, escape the container, and because they have that ability, they can go from there. Okay, run as root allowed. How's that different from what we just talked about?
Yeah, so these are all somewhat related. If you're listening to us thinking these sound like they all kind of connect together, they do. So running as root allowed allows the container to literally run as the root user, or alternatively to specify that it shouldn't do so. So there's a way of specifying this, a couple ways of specifying this. One is that in your security context of your container specification, you can say run as non-root is set to true, which requires that the container not run as root. Now, there are multiple ways that can happen. One of them is that your image, the container image that you build, you can have that image specification run as a non-root user. So if you're making a Docker file, you could say user 1001, for example, and it will run as that ID instead. There's also more configuration directives in your Kubernetes pod and container specification that you can say run as user and give it a UID, similar to how I just described about your container. So one thing to also consider when you are updating your workloads to not run as the root user is that you want to do testing of your application when you change these options to make sure that it still functions. There are some container images that assume they have initial root access, even if they don't use it all the time. So a classic example of this is a container that wants to copy some files around when it starts to help bootstrap itself. And that copy operation often might assume that it needs root privileges to do that, even if the application doesn't. So it's important to set these and to not run your workloads as root. It's also equally important with all of these things we've talked about, dropping capabilities and making sure you can't escalate privileges, to test your workloads in a non-production environment as you've made these changes to make sure that your workload does all the things that it used to do.
And to go back to, like, we're giving a lot of examples of security problems that can exist in Kubernetes. Guardrails around these things are just a team, sometimes that's a platform team, a security team, whomever, writing policy and enforcing it in a way that people are not allowed to do these things. So when I'm a developer and I go to push my container into production or my workload into production and find out that I have privilege escalation allowed, there's something that's going to stop me and say, wait, you shouldn't do that. That's all the guardrail does. Or you can't do that, as the case may be. Okay, let's talk about image vulnerabilities. Robert, this is when I'm deploying my log4j in my container, right? Or is it something different?
Yeah, no, this is a really important one. So every container that you deploy into your cluster, has probably a base operating system, like Alpine or Ubuntu, and then it has some binaries installed on top of that. You need to make sure that those containers, all the software is up to date and doesn't contain any known vulnerabilities. Kendall brought up Log4j is probably the biggest, most recent one that's been announced. So any Java applications that are using Log4j and have that vulnerability, you should be able to catch that early on in the process and basically disallow it and say, nobody can ship a container into the cluster that has, Log4j installed in it, or a vulnerable version of it. It's important for more than just that, though. There's new vulnerabilities getting announced every day. It could be in PHP, it could be in Git, it could be in curl. Any application that you're using inside that container could be vulnerable. So it's important to just repeatedly scan those images and make sure they don't have any known vulnerabilities.
I mean, even the base operating system can have known vulnerabilities, right? You can discover that this or that version of Ubuntu is actually, somebody's figured out that if a way to hack it so that you can do all kinds of things you're not supposed to do. So having it's one thing to build guardrails that are point in time guardrails, right? It's another thing to build dynamic guardrails that will update in a meaningful way. And so having tools in place that are going to watch for changes in known vulnerabilities, and 5 minutes ago it won't stop a deployment with that in it, but now there's an issued CVE and it's caught up to the database, however fast that updates, and all of a sudden things are changed. So that's important because dynamic guardrails, they need to change. They need to change over time. And back to our example of winding mountain road, having guardrails in place up a winding mountain road are, for the most part, pretty static, but sometimes erosion happens and a part of the road falls off, and you really need to move that guardrail in a little bit, and that's all that's happening here. We have one more example guardrail, role-based access controls, and Ivan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of a big general one, but role-based access control is essentially the permissions framework that you can grant access to Kubernetes, either to humans or to workloads that are running in Kubernetes. So there's a lot of things that we can check here, but some high level pieces that we find are particularly valuable for customers with respect to guardrails are, don't grant the quote unquote systems admin permissions to people in your cluster. It does require extra work, as always, to figure out what permissions do I need different teams to have in different clusters. Development versus staging versus production kind of thing. But using RBAC to grant that, again, least privilege security model is particularly important. Don't use groups like system masters. And it's easy in the beginning. It helps you on some level continue to move fast in your Kubernetes journey, but then everyone has super privileges. And so that's a big one. There's another one that is something we've recently worked on, added to one of our products, in fact, which is having workloads in your cluster that can automatically talk to the Kubernetes API, the same Kubernetes API that we as humans talk to manage our cluster and to query it for the things that are running there. That same API can be accessed by workloads running in the cluster as well. And while by default, the service account that's used to grant that access is pretty locked down for the most part, it's something that is important to make sure that you're not mounting those privileges if you know that your workload will never need to talk to the Kubernetes API. So those are just two good examples of how role-based access control can be used to help protect things. Like secrets is another one I'll give quickly. Instead of putting secret information, sensitive information rather, into other resources in Kubernetes, like static environment variables or into config maps, put them into a resource that Kubernetes provides that's called a secret. And that's then a separate type of resource that you can use RBAC to help protect.
So to say that in very layman terms, the role-based access control is making sure that the technical evangelist at your company has very different privileges than, say, the VP of development or even a developer, because frankly, I do not need access to the same things. I don't need the same level of access. And also neither do your workloads all need the same level of access. So
right. Absolutely. And, we have tools to help with this. For example, we've got an open source tool called RBAC Manager that, among other things, can help you based on labels assigned to Kubernetes namespaces, create RBAC permissions for ephemeral deployments, like a namespace that may only last for a day, but based on a label that's applied to that namespace, you can grant developers more access to those environments because they're ephemeral feature branches that are requiring more interaction, troubleshooting and deleting pods and those kinds of things, versus you wouldn't have that kind of permission in a staging or a production environment.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to get into next, very shortly, the where and the how of some of this. So, okay, we at Fairwinds, first of all, that's a few examples of guardrails you can build. Without the right tooling, it's really hard to know how to lock some of those things down. We're going to get into the tooling in a few minutes. Having a team whose sole job it is to dynamically make sure all of these guardrails are in place is an awful lot of maintenance. So leverage pre-existing art because it's out there. And we'll talk about what some of that is. It's important to note one of the things, because we as a company have seen lots and lots of Kubernetes clusters over the years and build software that plays in this space, we've run some benchmarks against what's normal. And we've seen that 54% of organizations are leaving more than half of their workloads open to privilege escalation and thus security holes. So this is one that we were just talking about. More than half of organizations are leaving more than half of their workloads open to privilege escalation. It's very common for people to just miss some of these things. And that's because you're going to miss them unless you have great tooling in place. So first, let's talk about where you need to implement guardrails, and then we'll get into the how. And Robert, you want to talk us through this graphic here, why we need guardrails both in CI/CD and at the time of admission and in runtime, and how that works.
Yeah, so it's really a three-step process for making changes to your cluster if you're doing things kind of the right DevOpsy way. At the first step, somebody should be making a change inside of an infrastructure as code repo. So maybe they're in GitHub, they modify a file that says, I want this container to run as root instead of running as a particular user. They would open up a pull request to merge that change into the main branch, and it's important to have a guardrail in place there that says, hey, I see you're trying to make this change. But I'm going to stop you, unless you have specific permission, like you're going to be stopped from making this change right now. And that's important because the developer gets very quick feedback as they're, creating that new deployment or trying to modify its configuration. And they can course correct before they actually merge that change. But one step further in the process is the emission controller. Not every change goes through a CI/CD process. Sometimes, you might be firefighting and you're trying to just get something working in the cluster. Or maybe you don't have a perfect, infrastructure as code approach just yet. Or maybe you've got something inside your cluster that is kind of automatically changing things. So it's important to implement some of these guardrails at the time of admission. So at the time the change is being made in the cluster. It's better to catch them earlier on in the process, say in CI/CD, but the admission controller kind of serves as a like a bouncer to your cluster. It's kind of a last resort as things are happening into the cluster, as those changes would be made. It can stop things at that point in time. And then finally, you want some kind of runtime guardrails in place. So you want to look at your live environment, which is really your source of truth, and be able to say, okay, I know I've got 6 workloads that are running as root, or I've got 10 workloads with privilege escalation allowed. This is important for 2 reasons. One, you're always going to need to make exceptions. You might have a workload that's just right now it's engineered to run as root. Like I think Ivan was explaining before, maybe it needs that permission to move some files around. And it's important to just kind of know, okay, we've made that exception and like we're going to keep our eyes on it. There's also things like Kendall mentioned earlier. Sometimes you might admit a workload into the cluster that has no CVEs, but a new CVE gets announced a day later. You really want that kind of live, runtime detection to say, okay, now this workload has a vulnerability in it. We need to make sure we go back to the beginning of our process, fix that vulnerability, and get it redeployed. So it's really kind of three different pillars where you need to implement guardrails at CI/CD, on your infrastructure as code, at the time of admission as things are entering the cluster, and then in runtime once things are already inside that environment.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we've talked about the where. Let's talk about the how. What are some tools that enable people to do this? So we're gonna talk about open source. We've got a number of open source tools that play in this space. We're going to talk about custom policy, how you can write custom policy that addresses this, and then multi-cluster environments. I don't know how we want to tackle this. Ivan, you want to start with open source? Talk about some of our guardrails tools, Polaris, Nova, Pluto, what they do in the guardrail world.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a lot of really cool open source that you also check out if you aren't already familiar with it. And I'll talk briefly about three of them. So Polaris is a tool that can be used in all those modes that Robert described as a policy enforcement tool in your Kubernetes cluster. So it can run in CI and give you an audit of things. It can run as an admission controller on its own. And it can also be run with a dashboard in your cluster to help give you that real-time visibility. And we have a number of policies that are built into Polaris or checks that are built into Polaris for a lot of the things like we've been talking about here today, running as root, allowing privilege escalation, etc. There's another tool called Pluto that we have. I'll come back to Nova in a sec. There's another tool called Pluto that helps you detect Kubernetes API versions that are either deprecated, so they will in the future be removed in their current version, or they perhaps already have been removed. So to paint a more clear picture in English about what does that really mean for folks that are just getting into Kubernetes, as you upgrade your Kubernetes cluster, the API or the interface that humans and other programs use to talk to Kubernetes and have it do things for you evolves over time. And like with any API, there are occasionally backwards incompatible or breaking changes, and things naturally evolve in that way over time. So what Pluto helps you do is get a heads up about those changes that will be coming. So if you're running Kubernetes 1.22 and you're about to upgrade to 1.23, then you can use this tool to help you get a heads up about things that are deprecated that you might not have been aware of that are going to be removed in that new version of Kubernetes. Nova is a really cool tool that helps you find out-of-date deployments of Helm charts, and I believe there's also some image abilities recently in there as well. But Nova is going to help you find things that you've deployed using the Kubernetes package manager, which is the description of the Helm tool that you might have deployed a while ago. And there's a new version of that Helm chart that also upgrades that deployment. And you might need to upgrade that for vulnerabilities and security or stability reasons. And so Nova is going to give you a nice view of your Helm charts and what should be upgraded there.
Great. And when you implement all these things and you find out of the box you have a whole bunch of nice checks, but you still need to write some custom things, talk about OPA and Open Policy Agent, Robert.
Yeah, so as Ivan explained, the open source projects come with a bunch of great out-of-the-box checks that are applicable across organizations. But sometimes your organization might have some special requirements around what can and can't be done. So for instance, you might want to make sure that every deployment inside your Kubernetes environment gets labeled with a cost center code so that you can, figure out billing, for instance. For that, you would need a custom policy. So there's a project called OPA, or Open Policy Agent. Polaris as well can do a lot of custom checks. So you might want to adopt a slightly more sophisticated project in order to be able to implement those kinds of custom behaviors. And again, both OPA and Polaris can be run in CI/CD, in admission control, and in a live cluster.
Great. And if all of that sounds overwhelming and implementing all of those things sounds like a lot of work, it can be, especially if you're doing it across more than one cluster. And that's why Fairwinds has Fairwinds Insights, which is our software for Kubernetes governance, CI/CD through to production. And at a high level, what Fairwinds Insights looks to do is solve that challenge for companies that are adopting Kubernetes, that are moving to cloud native. They need visibility into security, cost optimization, policy, and guardrails. And that's where we come in. So with Fairwinds Insights, I'm going to shift over and do a brief demo and actually show you what this looks like. This is what makes it easy for you to operationalize policy across lots of clusters. So it's one thing to have policy in one place, but if you have a large organization, and here we have an organization with lots of different Kubernetes clusters, it's going to be difficult to have uniform policy across your organization without a tool like Fairwinds Insights. So when you log into Insights, what you're going to see is an overview of the organization, all of the clusters in your organization. You can sort them by health score or the number of action items, and you can track trends over time. You can see down here we have a production environment that's doing a lot worse than a lot of the other ones. You can click into any of these clusters, and I've got this open here. This is what that looks like. So the cluster overview, we're going to show you where action items were introduced into your cluster, where things have been removed over time. We track that health score over time, so you can see if you're doing better or worse. This cluster has a 94, so it's getting an A. And you can see we have a whole bunch of action items being tracked here, prioritized. 26 critical, 9 high, 26 low, 117 medium, and then a whole bunch that are passing. So this is a big overview of the cluster, including some cost management, which I'll get into shortly. Where we're getting all this from is a whole bunch of open source projects that we've married together here inside of Insights. And then there's some proprietary logic built above and beyond that. So Polaris is our project for checking for common Kubernetes misconfigurations that we've seen here. It's something that Fairwinds built. Other Fairwinds open sources, Nova and Pluto, built into here. We also have Goldilocks, which works on resource requests and limits. And then there's support for Trivy, KubeBench, KubeSec, and we also support Open Policy Agent as well. So this is what's going to make it easy to manage lots of complicated policy at scale across your organization in a uniform way. And when all of these things come together, it rolls up into a big, long list of action items. And this is what that action items page looks like. So here we are sorted by severity, and a lot of the critical severities are images with vulnerabilities or security-related things. And then any engineer can come in here, click on one of these, and it's going to pull up both what's wrong as well as talk through remediation for how to improve it. So you don't have to be a super senior engineer to click on one of these things and find out, hey, I need to go in and update this to not be running with a known CVE, that kind of thing. But if you're like me and you're an engineer that sees all of these things and it overwhelms you, like the last thing you want is a big long list of problems that you need to go solve. And Fairwinds Insights, really a big part of our pitch is we want you to stop having to be the Kubernetes help desk. We want you to be able to go out there and enable your teams through service ownership to do what they need to do as an organization. And so you want to have that built in through the CI process or at the admission controller level, as Robert talked about before. With Fairwinds Insights, you write the policy once and it's implemented everywhere. So here we have Fairwinds Insights with a CI report. Here's an engineer removing some security and reliability configuration and what needs to be solved in terms of this is not going to go through. So therefore, I'm a developer, I get this far, I recognize I've made lots of mistakes and my deployment is actually blocked from happening. This is how guardrails look in the real world. So this is what a Fairwinds Insights CI report looks like, and this is pushing that left so that developers are enabled to fix the problems on their own. They can click on one of these issues, it'll take them into the UI, and it'll show them what they need to go about doing in order to fix it. So to come back to this, there's a whole bunch more in this platform, including, we will give you an overview of vulnerabilities running in your clusters, the severity of the issues that you have. We can scan repositories, talk to you about compliance. There's ways to integrate this lots of different places, including automation, so you can kick things out to, say, Jira or some other ticketing system that you have when issues are created. And finally, we do also have an efficiency tab here where we're going to get into some of the cost management. So when you come into this page, you're going to see an overview of the relative total cost of each workload, the relative daily cost throughout. And then on each workload, you can come down and see this is what it's costing you. And if you take our recommendations, this is what it'll cost you per month. You can choose the quality of service because we can make recommendations based on that. And you can click into any of these workloads. It's going to show you this is what the actual usage is. So therefore, this is what we recommend in terms of requests and limits. And you can copy that from the information here. So this is how we're enabling your teams, security, cost, et cetera, through policy, build out guardrails with Fairwinds Insights. It's a comprehensive platform that does all of this. There's a lot more here that I'm not showing you, but if you want to get in touch and have somebody walk you through it and talk about how it might be relevant to your organization, we're more than happy to do that. So let's wrap this up, this section, with a poll, and then we'll get to some Q&A if folks have questions. What is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Is it getting help with the basics, getting a best practice assessment, improving the security posture of your clusters, saving money, or improving the reliability of the apps running in Kubernetes? Spend a minute and fill that out for us. We'll pull up what those results are here in a second as people are filling that out. Okay, results as they're coming in. Looks like getting some general best practice assessment is part of what people are looking for. So one thing I want to say is, depending on your organization, in most situations, setting up Fairwinds Insights is a pretty light lift. If you have unusual security concerns that it's going to bump up against, we can help you with that. But if you want a best practice assessment, it's pretty easy to sign up in our POC process. We would be happy to meet with you, set this up, and run insights and real quickly give you a pretty high overview of what's wrong, what would all need to be fixed. You can install it in a staging environment, have a pretty good feeling for what's there. We're always, most of our customers are running it in production, but if you're nervous about that, get started in something lightweight. We're happy to help. And there we go. Okay, so let me see. I think we've got one more slide here. We do have a benchmark report. So if you want to come look at best practices in Kubernetes, we have this white paper, and I'm sure that will be sent out to everyone later. But let's spend a minute and look at Q&A. Are there any questions that folks have that you want us to answer as we go? I don't see anything in the Q&A tab right now. You're welcome to put it in chat or in Q&A. But I want to give a little bit for people to ask. And let me ask, is there anybody who's working on this right now that's running into specific security concerns and you'd like a guardrail built? I'd be curious to hear what kinds of guardrails are obvious to you that you'd need today.
Yeah, what's stopping you or concerning you or holding you back from being able to move forward?
Yeah, or what is the security department in your organization telling you that you can't use Kube until you've figured out X or Y? That's also a common thing that we see. And we'll give it a few minutes. Don't everybody answer all at once.
Hey, Kendall, I just wanted to jump in, take this opportunity to let everyone know about that sticky message at the top of the chat, but we will be reconvening here with two other speakers from Fairwinds 1 month from today on October 13th, and we'll be diving into both Nova and Pluto and going into some live demos on those. So if you are interested in finding out more about those resources, please do click that link and go ahead and register.
Great. And that's fine. It's okay if we don't have any questions. I can turn it back over to you, Cody. I do want to say, folks, if you have more questions or you want to get in touch, we are happy to walk you through more in depth on what this platform looks like, what our open source looks like. We have an open source or a community Slack as well. You can pop in and ask questions, but happy to connect with you. Happy to go deeper on how Fairwinds fits what you're doing specifically. And Cody, with that, I will stop sharing screen and turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Kendall. And Robert, Ivan, thank you both so much for joining us as well and sharing your expertise with our audience. Just a quick reminder that today's session was in fact recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand, or you can find it living on the Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So I did promise at the top of the hour to give out 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Vaisal O. Our second winner, Sylvain L. Our third winner is Randall K. And our fourth and final winner is Ron U. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim those gift cards. But if you do not see an email, please check your spam folder. So to our panel today, thank you so much for joining us. We would like to express our gratitude to Fairwinds for sponsoring today's program. And of course, to our audience, we really appreciate you spending time with us today. We ask for 1 extra moment of your time to fill out a brief survey that will pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we hope everyone has a great rest of your day. I'm just doing one last call to make sure we don't have any questions. Perfect.
Yeah, I still don't see anything yet. Looks good. We were very thorough, Cody. That's why it's hard to have questions when you go this deep.
Awesome. Well, Kendall, Ivan, and Robert, thank you all so much. And to our audience, thank you as well. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thanks, folks.